What happens when, like, the most productive mental week of your entire year is also the exact same week your physical body just completely falls apart?
I mean, it's a wild paradox, right? But it happens.
It really does.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this right now, I know you. You're a learner. You're the kind of person who is constantly juggling a dozen different interests.
Oh, absolutely.
You're trying to optimize your physical health. You've got your highly technical hobbies, your demanding side projects.
And you are always trying to find that perfect, elusive balance, which, by the way, is incredibly difficult. Because human beings are not, clean binary machines. We like to think of ourselves that way. Like, you push a pedal, the car accelerates, you plug in a cable, the battery charges.
Right. The human biology colliding with intellectual ambition, it's much murkier.
Exactly. You simply cannot isolate the mind from the body.
And that collision is exactly what we are getting into today on this deep dive. We have a genuinely fascinating source to guide us. The weekly journal entry, specifically week 18 of the year 2026.
Published on May 3rd, right?
Yep, May 3rd. Written by a developer named Ang. And our mission today is not just to read through a personal diary. We're going to explore the profound, messy, and honestly highly instructive connection between our biological systems, so our health,
and our digital systems, the programming languages we use to build the modern world.
Right.
It serves as a perfect case study in cause and effect, really. It shows us the cascading consequences of what happens when we push past our human limitations just to satisfy our intellectual curiosity.
Okay, let's unpack this. The journal entry starts with a setup that seems completely mundane. I mean, it's just a rainy week.
Just some bad weather.
Right. The weather keeps Ang stuck indoors. It disrupts normal outdoor gardening chores, halts any planned travel. But this simple shift in the weather triggers a massive spike in mental productivity,
while simultaneously setting off a complete physiological breakdown. And to understand the incredible technical output Ang achieves later in the week, we first have to look at that physical foundation. We need to look at what fueled and what ultimately broke the physical machine.
So let's look at the sleep data first, because it's kind of the first major domino to fall. Ang reports an average of 6.6 hours of sleep a day.
Which, on the surface, doesn't sound terrible.
Right. I want to push back on this a little bit. 6.5 hours isn't optimal, but it doesn't sound like a medical emergency. Why does this trigger a complete physical collapse?
Because the total duration is only half the story. The critical detail Ang notes is that this sleep was wildly fragmented.
Like how fragmented?
Ang recorded 13 separate sleep sessions over the course of the week.
Wait, really? 13?
Yeah. Basically, Ang was sleeping twice a day. And that completely sabotages the body's recovery architecture.
Oh, wow.
Human beings need a continuous, uninterrupted block of sleep, typically 7 to 8 hours, to properly cycle through the necessary stages of REM and deep sleep.
So splitting it up is it ruins it.
Exactly. When you slice your sleep into 13 distinct chunks over 7 days, you're essentially constantly rebooting the system before it can ever finish running its maintenance protocols. You just aren't getting full REM cycles.
And Ang outlines exactly what the biological fallout of that fragmented sleep looks like. The journal points out that this lack of deep sleep rapidly led to physical exhaustion, a noticeably weakened immune system.
Intense brain fog.
Yeah, intense brain fog and a severe hormonal imbalance.
And that hormonal cascade, that is the hidden driver of everything else that follows. When you severely disrupt your circadian rhythm like that, your body's ghrelin and leptin levels go completely out of whack.
Remind me, those are the hunger hormones, right?
Right. They regulate your feelings of hunger and satiety, so your body basically forgets when it's full.
Which perfectly explains the sudden diet changes Ang documents.
Yeah.
Because usually Ang follows a very deliberate, highly structured diet.
Yeah,
the journal mentions a 16 to 8 intermittent fasting schedule, meaning fasting for 16 hours and eating only during an 8-hour window. And that's combined with a 5 to 2 routine.
Which usually means eating normally for 5 days and restricting intake for 2. It's intense.
It is. And Ang also uses a very specific macro portioning strategy, sticking to a ratio of 2 to 1 to 1 or 2 to 2 to 1 for plants, protein, and carbs.
All while aiming for only 70% fullness at any given meal. I mean, it is a highly disciplined approach to fueling the body.
But because of the fragmented sleep and that hormonal imbalance you just mentioned, that discipline just evaporated.
Of course it did. The biology took over.
The disrupted hormones triggered frequent snacking. Aang mentions eating much more frequent meals, and even though they were smaller portions, it completely broke the 16 to 8 fasting protocol.
The cascading effects here are just fascinating. The rain keeps Aang indoors and immobile. The lack of natural light and outdoor activity disrupts the sleep.
The fragmented sleep disrupts the hormones.
Exactly. The hormones disrupt the diet. And because Aang is stuck inside, awake at odd hours, all of that restless energy gets poured into deep, immersive coding projects.
And when Aang gets into that coding zone, the physical data gets even more extreme. Aang tracks weight closely, noting a moving average of 69.36 kilograms.
Okay.
But at one point, the weight plummeted to 68.65 kilograms.
Yeah.
And not from burning fat, but simply because Aang didn't drink any fluids for 6 straight hours.
6 hours.
Just totally locked into the screen, completely forgetting to consume water.
Wow. Well, that is a textbook physiological symptom of hyperfocus. The brain requires so much cognitive bandwidth to process complex logic that it literally overrides the body's basic thirst signals. You basically forget you're a biological entity that requires hydration.
That's terrifying and amazing at the same time. And the physical consequences keep compounding. Because of the immobility, the hyperfocus, and the rain, Aang's step count dropped to around 4,004 steps a day.
Barely moving.
Right. And the ultimate result of all this neglect, a relapsed knee injury featuring nerve pain and muscle spasms. Yeah, it is all perfectly interconnected. Think of it like running a high-performance computer with a failing battery. The CPU, so Aang's brain is running at 100% capacity.
Oh, it's not plugged in.
Exactly, because it's not plugging in for a full uninterrupted recharge, the REM sleep, and because it is overheating from a lack of coolant, the hydration, the hardware simply starts failing. The knee gives out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it illustrates a fascinating paradox inherent to knowledge work. Total physical immobility actually enabled a profound state of cognitive hyperfocus.
Yeah.
Aang explicitly notes that while physically this was a highly inactive and painful week, mentally it was the single most productive week of the entire year.
Which is wild.
It is. And the recovery strategies Aang finally implemented, massaging the knee, using heat pad treatments, forcing increased fluid intake like green tea, and finally securing a solid late evening rest. Those were essentially just triage.
Just putting out fires.
Right. They were basic maintenance tasks required to keep the brain online. The physical body was voluntarily sacrificed for the intellectual output.
Okay, so the body is practically immobilized by exhaustion and this knee injury. But because Aang is physically trapped on the couch, all that restless energy has to go somewhere.
Right. The physical standstill literally forces a mental marathon.
So let's look at what Aang was actually doing while nursing a bad knee, drinking green tea, and listening to the rain outside.
Aang was channeling all that intense focus into a highly complex personal programming project using Haskell.
And for anyone unfamiliar, Haskell is notorious in the programming world.
Very much so.
It is a purely functional language, deeply rooted in mathematics, and it has a famously steep learning curve. It is not the kind of language you casually pick up on a Sunday afternoon.
No, definitely not.
And Aang's specific goal was highly technical, successfully converting a plain Chinese text file into a PDF document using a TIPS template.
Yeah, and TIPS is a modern code-based typesetting system, often used as a sleeker alternative to older systems like LaTeX for formatting complex documents.
Right.
So getting a purely functional language like Haskell to seamlessly interface with a modern typesetting system, just to output perfectly formatted Chinese characters into a PDF, that is a significant technical achievement.
Aang also notes there are plans to add more ebook formats later, but just hitting that core functionality was a massive win.
Oh, absolutely.
And the way Aang cemented that new knowledge is a great lesson for any learner. It wasn't just about writing the code and moving on. Aang spent hours writing about the discoveries made while coding.
Writing to reinforce learning.
Exactly. Aang even mentions utilizing NotebookLM, an AI research assistant, to generate podcasts and videos based on those notes as a study aid.
That's super clever.
Yeah. The goal was to use the AI to identify missing gaps in understanding. It's a brilliant way to use artificial intelligence as a personalized tutor.
However, this brings us to a stark contrast in the journal.
Oh, yeah.
Because while Aang utilizes AI to accelerate personal learning, there is a very different, almost visceral reaction to AI out in the wild. The journal notes a complete lack of motivation to contribute to open source projects on GitHub lately.
And the reason given is the, quote, endless sea of AI and LLM-generated projects. Aang says it just kills the motivation to contribute when everything feels automated.
Right.
But I had to play devil's advocate here. Isn't AI supposed to make coding easier? Isn't it supposed to handle the tedious boilerplate so developers can focus on the fun stuff? Why is an endless sea of AI code killing Aang's drive to participate?
Well, what's fascinating here is the psychological distinction between efficiency and craftsmanship.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence absolutely makes generating code more efficient, but for someone like Aang, software development isn't just about getting a product to market as fast as possible.
Bigger than that.
Exactly. It's a craft. It's an intellectual puzzle. When AI automates the code generation, the human joy of problem solving, the actual struggle to understand the underlying logic, is entirely stripped away.
Ah, I see. Think of it like buying a massive, complex Lego set. You buy it because you want the satisfaction of snapping the thousands of pieces together over a weekend.
Right.
If someone hands you the castle fully assembled, sure, you have the castle, but you missed the entire point of the toy.
Yeah.
The destination was achieved, but the journey was stolen.
That's a perfect analogy. When the destination is automated, the journey loses its meaning. And this perfectly explains why Aang retreated from GitHub and dove into highly complex, esoteric systems programming languages like Haskell.
Searching for the struggle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Aang is actively seeking out environments where human craft and deep understanding are still the primary drivers.
That makes total sense. And it also explains the types of hobbies Aang maintained during this intense week. Outside of the digital screen, Aang prioritized activities that are intensely grounded, physical, and high touch.
Like what?
Well, even with a knee injury in the rain, Aang engaged in short 1 to 3 minute sitting or walking meditations. Aang stuck to basic, mindful cooking, making oatmeal, eggs, and miso noodle soup.
Oh, nice.
There was also fish keeping, specifically priming pairs of Apistogramma cichlids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which are small, complex freshwater fish that require very precise water parameters to breed. Aang even managed some minor decluttering around the house.
I mean, these are analog activities. They require absolute presence. You cannot automate the care of a delicate fish or the process of mindful meditation.
Exactly. Although some tasks definitely fell off the radar,
Yeah.
like home improvement projects, installing curtains, doing balcony grout work that stalled completely, and reading a book called 3 Highs, didn't see any progress.
Fair.
But all of that intense human craftsmanship energy was redirected entirely toward programming languages. Because Aang was deliberately seeking genuine craft away from automated AI code, this led to a massive, deep exploration into systems programming languages.
And Aang surveyed quite a lineup of languages: Go, Rust, D, Zig, Nim, Crystal, and Ada.
Quite the list.
But what is truly insightful is the strict, uncompromising filter Aang applied to evaluate them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Aang applied what we can call the apt install test. Aang writes that if a language cannot be installed via the apt install command on a standard Ubuntu Linux operating system, it is skipped entirely. Aang considers it not stable or accessible enough to bother with.
It's ruthless.
It is. This rule is basically the software equivalent of refusing to date anyone who doesn't live in your exact zip code. On the surface, it sounds incredibly restrictive, like you are artificially limiting your options before you even start looking.
It sounds restrictive, yeah, but it is a deliberate boundary. It's actually a brilliant way to filter for stability, maturity, and convenience.
How so?
If a programming language hasn't matured enough to be included in the standard Ubuntu package manager, Aang doesn't want to waste time wrestling with custom installations, compiling from source, or debugging setup errors.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. It's a boundary set by someone who highly values their cognitive load. And within that strict boundary, Aang makes some very pointed, specific critiques of the mainstream giants in the tech world, starting with Rust and Go.
Yeah, let's talk about Rust, because Rust is currently the absolute darling of the systems programming world.
Everyone loves it right now.
Yeah, and Aang is getting comfortable reading it, largely because it shares some fundamental design concepts with Haskell. Aang still feels Haskell is more elegant overall, but admits Rust wins on familiarity, its C-like syntax, its massive popularity, and its massive library ecosystem.
Aang also specifically notes Rust's inclusion as a supported language for Linux kernel development.
Which is huge.
It's massive. In the open source world, being adopted by the Linux kernel is the ultimate stamp of stability and longevity.
But then we get to Go, and Aang actively dislikes it.
Which is a highly controversial stance. Go was developed by Google. It's heavily adopted across the industry and is constantly praised for its efficiency. People almost universally call it minimalist.
But Aang doesn't see minimalism. Aang calls it primitive.
Wow.
The journal notes that the syntax is unappealing, but points out a very specific functional flaw. The standard library in Go is surprisingly thin for CLI command line interface development.
We should probably clarify why a standard library matters so much to a developer.
Yeah, go for it.
A standard library is the pre-written code that comes bundled with a language. Think of it as the foundation of a house.
Okay.
If you use a language with a robust standard library, the concrete is already poured, and you can start building the walls immediately. If the standard library is thin, you have to mix and pour your own concrete before you can even begin your actual project.
And Ang is building CLI applications programs that run entirely in the text-based terminal. Ang's basically saying, don't tell me this language is minimalist and efficient if I have to build my own basic tools just to get a terminal app running.
Exactly. And Ang's critique really encourages us to deeply question industry consensus. Just because a massive tech giant like Google built a tool and everyone praises it, doesn't mean it's the right tool for a craftsman building a very specific type of project.
And because the mainstream giant disappointed Ang, the search had to shift. Ang started looking for lesser-known languages that are batteries included for CLI development. Which brings us to the exploration of Zig, D, and Ada.
Let's start with Zig. Zig is currently hyped in developer circles as a modern C. It's designed to be small, fast, and incredibly powerful for low-level systems.
Right.
But Ang found it lacking for this specific use case.
The issue comes down to memory management and high-level support, doesn't it?
Yeah. When you write software, the program needs to use your computer's memory. In higher-level languages, memory management is automated. The language cleans up after you.
Like having a maid service.
Exactly. But in lower-level languages like C or Zig, you have to manually allocate and free up memory. Zig doesn't have the high-level built-in library support needed to quickly build console apps without having to explicitly manage all that memory yourself.
Got it.
It's great if you are building an operating system, but terrible if you just want to quickly build a text-based tool.
Which naturally led Ang to the D programming language. According to the journal, D hits the absolute sweet spot.
It does.
It's highly readable, it features simple syntax that isn't overly verbose, and crucially, it has great built-in CLI libraries.
Ang notes that D allows for more elegant code than competitors like Nim or Crystal.
Ang even says D feels more beginner-friendly and polished than Python.
Now that is a huge claim.
To anyone in tech, that is a massive statement, because Python is universally pitched as the ultimate beginner language.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then there's Ada. Ang describes Ada as a hidden gem, just waiting to be rediscovered.
Ada has such a fascinating historical context, too. It was originally designed for the United States Department of Defense in the late 1970s.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It was built explicitly for mission-critical systems where failure is simply not an option. Think aviation software, rail transit, and medical devices.
That makes total sense why it's so strict. Ang loves its underlying design philosophy. Ada favors explicitness over implicitness and prioritizes readability over brevity. It is heavily influenced by older languages like Haskell and BASIC. Ang says it is the only language they could comprehend immediately. Reading it felt like reading natural pseudocode without ever having written a single line of it before.
And when a programming language prioritizes human readability to that extreme degree, it drastically lowers the cognitive barrier to entry. You don't have to hold a massive mental model of hidden assumptions and obscure syntax rules in your head. The code tells you exactly what it's doing in plain language.
But this brings up a massive contradiction, and I have to ask the obvious question.
Okay, shoot.
If D is genuinely more polished than Python, and if Ada is incredibly robust and reads perfectly like natural human pseudocode,
Yeah.
why aren't they the most popular languages in the world? Why isn't every developer on Earth using D and Ada?
This raises an important question about how technological ecosystems evolve. Because the harsh truth is that the best technology doesn't always win. You have to account for technological momentum and ecosystem lock-in. Once a language like Python or Go gains a critical mass of users, massive companies build infrastructure around them, universities start teaching them as the default, and a massive third-party library ecosystem develops.
Oh, it is exactly like the QWERTY keyboard we all use.
Yes, perfect example.
Is it the most efficient layout for typing? Absolutely not. It was designed to keep mechanical typewriter keys from jamming. But everyone knows it, all the hardware is built for it, so we are perpetually locked into it.
Exactly. And for anyone learning a new skill in any field, this is a vital lesson. The most popular tool is not always the best tool for the specific job you're trying to do.
Sometimes the dominant tool is just the most deeply entrenched.
Right. Finding the right tool, the tool that actually respects your craft, often requires stepping completely off the beaten path, just like Aang did.
Let's step back and look at this entire journey, because the cause and effect here is incredible. We started with a rainy week. The weather trapped Aang indoors.
Which led to the fragmented sleep.
Right, that confinement, paired with a wildly fragmented sleep schedule of 13 different sessions, wrecked the body's REM cycles. The immune system dropped. Hormones like ghrelin and leptin fluctuated. Weight dropped due to severe hyperfocus dehydration.
The knee injury flared up.
Yes, forcing Aang to rely on heat pads and green tea just to stay functionally awake.
It was a total physical standstill. The biological hardware was failing.
But paradoxically, that exact physical standstill launched an absolute mental marathon.
Right.
While the body was failing, the brain was hyper-focused.
Doing incredible work.
Aang successfully translated Chinese text to PDF using Haskell and TWIR, rejected the automated hollow victory of AI-generated GitHub code in favor of human craftsmanship, and hunted down the perfect human-readable syntax in obscure systems languages like D and Ada.
So what does this all mean? If we look at both halves of this deep dive, we see a universal truth about the systems we manage.
Which is,
Our biological systems require very specific, non-negotiable inputs. Continuous REM sleep, proper hydration, balanced macros, physical movement to function elegantly. When we ignore those rules, the hardware breaks down.
yeah.
And our digital projects are exactly the same. They require the right structural foundations, they need the right syntax, robust standard libraries, and a philosophy that matches the developer's ultimate goal.
You cannot force an unreadable language to produce an elegant, maintainable workflow, just like you cannot force a sleep-deprived, dehydrated body to heal a bad knee.
Exactly. It all comes down to architecture.
The biology and the code, and it leaves me with a really provocative thought based on Aang's deep appreciation for Ada. Aang loved Ada because it prioritizes human readability. It practically reads like natural language,
Right,
which makes you wonder, to what extent are human spoken languages functioning as the operating systems of our own brains?
Oh, that's a fascinating thought. The grammar, syntax, and vocabulary we speak dictate how we process logic and frame our understanding of the world.
And if that is true, what happens when we let AI write all our text and generate all our code? If we stop wrestling with the syntax, if we stop doing the hard work of structuring our own thoughts and solving our own logic puzzles, will we lose the cognitive benefits of that struggle?
That's the real danger, isn't it?
Will our mental operating systems start to degrade, just like an unused muscle?
It's the ultimate hidden cost of automation. We might save a few hours of time, but we risk losing the rigorous craftsmanship of our own cognition.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. We want our minds and bodies to be clean, simple, binary machines. We want the code to be automated and the outputs to be instant.
But the real growth, the real deep learning, only ever happens when you wade into the murky waters, embrace the friction, and build the system yourself.
Thank you for joining us as we unpack this fascinating journal. Let it serve as a reminder to tend to your biological hardware just as carefully as you curate your digital software.
Keep learning, keep questioning the popular tools.
And we'll catch you on the next deep dive.